In the industry, in the discipline of negotiation, we call this the norm of reciprocity. So we love our jargon, right? But the norm of reciprocity, that there is a social norm around if I give you something in a commercial setting, I get something in return. So
Okay.
it's very useful to identify areas of agreement.
Hey everyone, we're back again. Yes, it's been 7 days. Now it's a new episode with a Titan's Tale, where we are inspired empires. And today, my Titan is all the way from New York's, well, not New York City, but real close, I guess. So in New York, Patrick Griffin. Patrick, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the time. Happy to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? And I've kind of read up on you, but tell our listeners all about Patrick.
Sure. Well, I'm really a lifelong entrepreneur, but I spent most of my career in the corporate world in New York City, actually. So I grew up downstate, outside of the city, spent the first part of the major chunk of my professional career working in finance in the bond rating industry and working on sales, pricing strategy, a little bit of product development, and a ton of negotiation. And then I moved into banking and I kept that finance focus. But I wasn't able to negotiate quite as much as when I moved into banking, and I missed it. So I started teaching negotiation about 6 years ago for the love of the art. I did it as a hobby on the side, a passion project. But earlier this year, I launched it as a formal business. And so now I'm the founder of Morgan Strategic Advisors, and I coach executives and entrepreneurs on how to negotiate in a B2B setting.
Awesome. Is it strictly B2B?
Well, that's really my expertise, but I think that you'd agree that when you have negotiation skills, they tend to trickle over to your personal life as well.
Okay.
But it's fundamentally my approach teaches people how to come to agreement, how to influence other people, how to understand the particular core competencies and values that they bring, and how to communicate that more clearly to people that are important to them.
I was looking, and you mentioned in my notes here, you got patience, reading people, and understanding value. And I wanted to hit on the understanding value first. Value from both sides, I assume, right? We're always trying to, as a negotiator, we're trying to do the win-win situation. They win, we win. We're not trying to take advantage of anybody.
Exactly. Yes, and actually, I would go beyond that and say my real ethos in negotiation is to grow the pie. So there's this idea of what we call distributive negotiation, where we're all arguing over a fixed pie, and I'm going to get my share and you're going to get your share. But the way I teach negotiation really involves creativity in a way that is often underestimated in negotiation. And when you're able to be creative and understand core value, you're often able to create value within the negotiation, and everybody walks away with more. So I shy away from the term win-win only because very often we're looking for that unforeseen value that really brings us to a next level when we're going throughout a negotiation. But in terms of when I talk about understanding value, and your question about value for both sides, value never exists in a vacuum. Value always requires an audience, right? And so or at least a recipient, or else there's nothing to measure it against.
Sure.
And so I've had the good fortune to work with a number of industries throughout my career, especially when I was in banking, and my skill in the financial markets earlier in my career. I was particularly good at handling the idiosyncratic asset classes and learning about stuff that was a little bit less conventional and more innovative. And through all of that, I developed an ability to really try to understand, develop an ability to understand the core competencies and core value offerings of companies, irrespective of industry. And so being able to sort of triangulate that and figure out how one party can be beneficial to another party, or an agreement can be beneficial, is something that I've learned to really deploy and leverage in a way that's been very satisfying.
When you mention negotiations, sometimes everything's negotiation, and I guess everything's negotiable, some people say. But in my mind, I'm thinking about these movies, and you're in New York City, and you have any ones that were ever tense, like we're back and forth.
Oh, yes.
It doesn't have to always be tense, though, right?
No, and in fact, I have found it's counterproductive to be tense. But there are people. So in my practice, I spend a lot of time talking about misconceptions of what negotiation is or should be or can be.
Mhm.
And the media, in the general sense, so movies, TV shows that we watch, it
Sure.
makes for excellent television. Having
Yeah.
that high intensity negotiation, that's just great television, and I love watching it. And actually, I was watching old movie Midnight Run recently, and that movie is just peppered with negotiation all over the place. And but that's really not how negotiations work most often in the real world. And so you don't need the high emotions, because what high emotions, they start changing the chemical composition in your bloodstream, and they start making decision making a little bit more difficult. They can affect your impartiality and your logic chains. And so I have had more than a few negotiations which were very intense. And I've had some that were deliberately intense, where my counterpart was looking to provoke a reaction. And that's a strategy that can work once. It's a short-term strategy. But in business to business negotiations, you're really looking for opportunities to continue that relationship after the first deal. You're ideally not looking for one-offs, you're looking for what we call infinite interactions. And so when you take those short-term approaches by trying to upset somebody, or trying to bully somebody, trying to mislead them, or even just in ways where you're sacrificing your credibility,
Mm.
it can be an effective short-term strategy. It's a miserable long-term strategy, because the other party just simply won't want to work with you next time. And so that's why I make the distinction with B2B, is really that focus on both short-term and long-term outcomes and continued opportunity in the future.
You say you don't call it win to win, which I can understand that. You're talking about growing. How do you refer to it as then? Because when you just basically tell these guys, hey, we're looking for long term, are you just open and blunt about it? Or how's that? Or is it just infer that we want to work together over time?
So it's based on context, as I'm sure you can imagine. Some negotiations are more transactional than others, and some are more relational. And I would consider those kind of the two poles.
Mhm.
Um, and if I'm kind of giving it short shrift, you could probably call it win-win. I don't mean that the term win-win is incorrect. I
Right.
just mean that it ties into a lot of people's preconceptions about negotiation that reinforce this idea of a fixed pie of this distributive negotiation. And so
I would get you.
what I just try to avoid reinforcing some of people's prior conceptions about negotiation, because I find that trying to first level set and then build a new understanding, kind of a new paradigm for them around deal making and negotiation, is useful. And sometimes that just involves changing the jargon. Industries like this are always chock full of jargon, and they can be useful when they're useful, and I find that it can be helpful. So
Sure. I would assume sometimes negotiation sometimes would require a third party, like a negotiator or an independent one, but that's not really realistic in a lot of negotiations. So how do you control the narrative, I guess is the proper word, or how do you control the meeting? Are you in control? Is it like a vice versa thing? When you teach your students or coaching, what do you do? What do you tell them?
sure. So I would say, so one distinction. So if you're having some sort of discussion that looks like a negotiation, but if there's a third party involved, that falls into the realm of mediation, which is
Mm,
something that is crucial and important, and something I frankly love doing. But it's a little bit different than negotiation, because of the negotiation is inherently a direct interaction
right.
in that sense. So
Are those usually
what
due
I
to the mediation? Is that usually due to the size of the project typically, or is it
no, mediation is actually it. So the most complex projects, excuse me, can still be done with just two parties involved. But you might not have, you'll most often not have one individual sitting on side of the table and another individual on the other side of the table. In those cases, you'll have teams working on both sides, which
gotcha?
is something
Okay.
that, and that's part of what I teach: how to construct a team, what the roles in that team should look like, the characteristics of the people within that team, what that should look like. But to
Mhm.
get back to your earlier question
Yeah.
about how that conversation runs and how to control it, if you want to control it.
Or
One term that we
lead
use
it.
is
Yeah.
lead it.
Yeah.
Running the room is another way of thinking about it. And I like control, and I think a lot of people who negotiate professionally do like control. But controlling a negotiation isn't always the same as, it's not like you're a leader in a classroom or something like that. Control in a negotiation is more about influence. And so the ways that I suggest that people do that, the first and foremost, so the paradigm that I work with most often is called the 4 phases method of negotiation, also called the universal method. And so it teaches the building blocks of a negotiation, where you start with your preparation, you go into the dialogue phase. So preparation is everything before you get to the table. Dialogue phase, where you're actually interacting directly, you're sharing information, exchanging information. And then you move on to proposal phase. Ideally, somebody has an idea about how to get this deal done. They make a suggestion. That's the proposal phase. And then eventually, you might bounce between those, but eventually you get to a close phase if there's a deal to be made. And so I work within that construct. But a big part of the preparation phase, and as you enter into the dialogue phase, you'll be gathering certain materials. You'll put together your list of positions, the things that you care about. You'll put together a wish list, the things that are important to you but aren't primary, right? These are nice to haves. And then crucially, you'll put together an opening statement. And so a negotiation very often starts really in the preparation phase, because when you're deciding on venue, are we, Chris, are we negotiating in my office or your office? Are we negotiating next week or is it next month? What amount of time do I have? All of these little things help inform the tenor of a negotiation when you get to the table. But then when you finally sit down, and maybe it's a literal table and maybe it's not, but when you get to that
point.
forum, an opening statement can go a long way towards informing the tone of the conversation and really directing attention from your counterparty where you want it to be. So you use the opening statement to emphasize what's important to you, emphasize the mutual value that you think you'll both get out of it. You want to communicate to them why they should care, why they should be in a deal-making mode at all. And so that's really, when you're in the room, literal or figurative room, that's where that influence begins. And the opportunity presents itself to help guide that conversation, influence that conversation in a direction that you want. And it's rarely bombastic. I knew a man early in my career, tremendous professional. He was a Harvard trained lawyer. He was a leader of mine, not my direct boss. And he could lead an entire room without saying a word, just with the power of his eyes, because he was incredible at silence. So he might ask a question, right? So he would say a few words, but he would ask a question, and then he was so gifted at being quiet and listening and making you want to fill that space with information. And so very often when we're negotiating, there is an imbalance of information, and it's a battle is the wrong word, but there's a degree of competition over who corrects their imbalance of information more. Even if it's collaborative, you really want to gain as much information as you can. That's part of your objective. And this man, I've never seen anybody as gifted at that as he is, because he just knew the power of silence, and his control of a room was done, inaudibly.
Right.
And so it doesn't. So the leadership and the influence and the directing a conversation like that in the room can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's the bombastic guy, but very often it's the person with that steadiness and that draw that really elicits reactions from other people.
We talk a lot about here on the Titan's Tale about building teams, and teams are important. That you just can't do it all yourself, and you got to find those experts. And you mentioned hiring or building a team. How do you go about that in your specialty, I guess?
So there are 3 main, we think of them as roles in a negotiation that need to be performed. And sometimes it's a single individual that will perform all these roles, and sometimes it's, up to 3 or more individuals that might perform it. But fundamentally, you want somebody in a leader position. This is the person that's going to be driving the conversation for your side of the table. Then you'll want a summarizer. And this is somebody who will be speaking some amount. They will be there to reinforce areas of agreement, to help you keep track of what's been agreed upon, the progress that you've made so far, maybe help ask some questions about areas that need a little bit more light shed on them. And then you'll have somebody acting as observer. And that person, generally speaking, keeps their mouth shut. But their job is to observe tone, observe verbal and nonverbal cues from the other party. You know, they might pass a note to the observer or the leader, depending on the context, or they might just wait for a break if they want to share some feedback. But their job is to be eyes and ears. And counterintuitively, a lot of people think that the leader should always be the most senior person. And in my experience, that's not the optimal approach. Very often, at least in the corporate world, more senior people, in my world, in the finance world, we'd say they have more ink in their pen. They have greater approval authority for a deal. And some leaders, many leaders, unfortunately, they wind up feeling compelled to show that power that they have, that corporate institutional power that they have, by approving things that might not be in the interest of the organization as a whole. And it's just a way of demonstrating power. I had one role where actually we had executive sponsors for each of our major relationships. And so these were the big guys. I worked a lot with global banks. So, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley. And for each of these, we had executive sponsors. The executive sponsors were very senior folks, SVP or higher. And they were not allowed, so they helped with the relationships, but they were not allowed to be part of the negotiation directly, the commercial arrangement, because they were incentivized differently than salespeople. And they would sometimes give away more than was necessary, because they also had, in that case, a narrower view. They were maybe part of the conversations with Morgan Stanley, but they weren't part of the conversations with Citi and Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. And so they had a less granular understanding of what the market would bear and what the market value was of these things. So there were a lot of moving variables involved. But the point is more that even institutionally, it was recognized that despite these people being 3 levels of seniority above me, they were not welcome in these particular conversations. And so it's interesting. So those are the 3 main roles. And what you want to look for when you're assembling that team, and again, it might be an individual, it might be a team makeup. Some members of the team might not wind up in the room for a negotiation, but they'll be really important for the preparation phase. And so there'll be some characteristics that you expect to see from these people. So you want certainly somebody with really granular subject matter expertise about the solutions or variables that you're negotiating. You want somebody with a really robust understanding of the market itself. So you've got the commercial aspect of it, the market in which you're operating. You also have the product level expertise, and that subject matter expertise that you're looking at. You want that can be the same person again, but you want to make sure you have those things covered. You want people who can communicate clearly and well, obviously being articulate and being somebody who's able to influence other people. That's desirable. But you also want the team to be a team that works well together, that has complementary skill sets. So if your leader is really, really great at speaking in the room, maybe she's incredibly compelling and she's wonderful at influencing other people, but maybe she isn't quite as good at the preparation stage and doing the market analysis and things like that. You want her to be your leader, and you want to make sure she has all the data and analytics that she can handle, but she's just not necessarily the right person to be taking the lead on that part of the preparation, right? So you want to make sure that what you build is a robust team that all works really well together and has these complementary and to some degree overlapping skill sets. And then finally, one thing I recommend in these characteristics, if there's an opportunity to have a warmer connection with your counterparty, then that's useful, that's desirable. So if I have a member of my team or a member in my organization who's close enough to this deal that has a particularly warm or strong relationship with somebody on the other side, at the other organization, I would like that person to be a member of my team, because if they can help everybody feel a little bit better, a little bit more collegial, a little bit, less friction in the conversations, that will yield better outcomes more often than not. And so what you're trying to do is build a team and again, this is so contextual. It really, there's, as you said, there's so many different ways to negotiate. We negotiate throughout our daily lives, but you want to set yourself up with a team that allows you to prepare robustly before you get to the table, and then have the right skills in the room that can listen, that can speak well and clearly, that can help move the conversation along when necessary, and really so ensuring that you have that end-to-end expertise that'll help you from the homework on through the closing stage is really critical. Now, one thing people ask me about, and I'll say this shortly because I think that I've given you an awfully long answer to this question, but
Great.
So attorneys, there's a big question often about attorneys in negotiation and what role they serve. And I come from a family of attorneys, and part of the reason I'm good at negotiation is because my dad was an attorney, and rhetoric, that art of argumentation is something that was always prized in my family and at the dinner
Sure.
table. And so that's really near and dear to my heart. And I work very well with lawyers. I really understand how they think. But I always did my best to keep the lawyers away from the negotiating table. And the reason for that is their incentives, their motivations, and what they ultimately get paid to do is different than what I got paid to do. When I was in strategic sales roles and product development and really trying to move the company forward, grow the company within the market, that was my objective. I wanted more revenue. I wanted growth. I wanted market share.
Mm-hmm.
An attorney's job is to protect the company. And so they are there as risk mitigant. And so that's a really important role. But we're not at risk until we sign a contract. And so the way that I recommend it, the way I teach it, is that we negotiate over a term sheet, and we agree on not a contract, but we agree on the variables and positions that we choose to agree on.
You agree on the
attorneys
portions of the contract, right?
These things that will then take their form in a contract, right?
Gotcha.
So
Mm-hmm.
so I'll say, payment terms. You really want net 30 terms. I really wanted net 15. We agree on net 30, sure, and I get something in exchange, of course. But that's not an attorney conversation. That's a business conversation. And so then my attorneys and your attorneys would get a sheet of paper that says, okay, well, the payment terms are going to be net 30. And the next term that I got in exchange for that is going to be X, and on down the line. And they'll receive essentially a checklist of things upon which we've orally agreed. And their job is to put that in a contractual format. And that winds up producing, that legal aspect, that can wind up producing a little bit of legal negotiation as well. But that is a secondary part of the whole enterprise. And because the other reason so lawyers in the room for the term sheet portion, for that real deal level negotiation, they tend to slow things down a little bit, but also they're expensive. And so having a lawyer at the table all the time, a lawyer at the table, usually costs more than it costs to have me at the table.
Well, they're charging you for a phone call to make the appointment. They're charging you for the time they're in there. They're charging. Yeah. I mean, they make good money and they're worth their every penny. But what you're saying is
really important.
Use them when you need them, not just have them there to be having them there, right?
Exactly. And then, one of the things I got good at, because I'm pretty comfortable with legal language and terminology, and I would never negotiate it directly, but I could then kind of code switch. When I was passing the term sheet over to my counsel, I could speak in their terms about the direction in which we'd agreed orally for the rest of the terms. So, we always talked about, oftentimes indemnification was a big subject of negotiation, and I never spoke to that directly, but I was able to hint to my counterparty about what my counsel's position would be on that, and then I could prepare my counsel for that conversation. Well, they had a number of questions around indemnification. That's definitely going to be something we talk about it. Let's make sure that we use this clause, which is a little softer, that we've used before, right? I know that we've used this clause before. I think the risk paradigm is the same. Let's try to take that route. And so as a negotiator and a deal maker becomes more sophisticated and can work closely with their counsel and really value their counsel, because it is important to value your attorneys. But just do your best to make their job easier, and they'll love you for it. You still get the deal done. You still protect the company from the risk, but you try to make their job a little bit easier in the meantime.
Gotcha. one question popped up. Is negotiations always tick for tack? Meaning that, all right, I want to give this up, but you're going to do this in return. Are you always trying to do that? Or is it just sometimes it's just agreed that, okay, not 30 days net pay is great. That's what we had in mind anyway. So how's that
Sure.
kind of?
So if there's area of agreement already, then no one's giving up anything, right? So but if I'm giving something up,
Mhm.
then I do want something in return. So if I'm moving off of a position that I have, and in the industry, in the discipline of negotiation, we call this the norm of reciprocity. So we love our jargon, right? But the norm of reciprocity, that there is a social norm around, if I give you something in a commercial setting, I get something in return. So
Okay.
it's very useful to identify areas of agreement. If you and I are both on board with net 30 terms, fantastic, right?
Yep.
That's a
Move
win.
on to the next subject. Yep.
Yeah. But let's say that we agree on net 30 terms and everything else is largely agreed upon, but we have one other thing where you want to discount, right? Maybe you just
Mhm.
want a little bit of a takeoff on maybe you want 5% off on my services or something like that. I might ask you to go net 15. So even if we agree on net 30, if you want me to move on my price, I'm going to need some sort of compensating factor for that. And
Sure.
that's what we mean about the norm of reciprocity. And so even if that's something that we had in principle agreed upon, ultimately there's a collective bubble of value that we're trying to capture. And if I give up a little bit on the actual total revenue, for example, then I might want to see that back on timeliness of payment.
And the fact you're going in negotiations, it's expected. I mean, that's what you're doing. You're giving and taking and back and forth till everybody agrees on a package or a contract. Um, let's say you're a new business owner and you're fortunate enough to get a good negotiation going on for a big contract, and you're real excited about getting the business. How do you teach your people or suggest that they don't give away the farm, or even look like, when I was first in sales and I didn't, I was just new, and they always said, fake it till you make it, or, you might be doing jumping jacks or cartwheels inside your stomach, but you always make sure like that, well, this is no big deal. Already done that. So somebody new, how do you teach them that kind of hold back, don't give away the show, and still get a, a contract that works for both of you?
That is an excellent question, Chris. And it's something that, because I love working with entrepreneurs and executives, and I do work with a fair number of early stage companies, it's really important to teach this. And so there's a few things, and it really, the crux of this will boil down to the preparation stage. And I personally think that, so I have a bit of bias here. So I'm unusual in that I love being at the table. The give and take, the actual conversation part of it that's a playground for me. And that's not true for many people who negotiate or have to or choose to negotiate.
Hmm.
Um, but because of that, because I realized that was the fun part for me, that really came naturally, I always invested a lot of the preparation phase. And it is the case that in negotiation, well, one, I believe that a lot of negotiations are won or lost in the preparation phase, as you develop your information and get your bedrock of understanding before you get to the table. Some negotiators estimate that you should spend as much as 80% of your time on just the preparation phase when you're entering a negotiation. So the reason I mention that, and I repeat that over and over again,
Mm.
is that there are a couple of specific analyses that you want to do as you get ready for this. So first and foremost, I want to make sure I phrase this well, but so no deal is better than a bad deal. So not making a deal with your counterpart is better than
Oh,
making a bad deal.
absolutely. I agree with that for
And
sure.
so
And I want
that's the
everybody to think
first
about what you
thing.
just said. No deal is better than a bad deal. So it's
Yeah,
okay to walk away from the table, right?
to walk
It's
away from the
okay.
table. And that's
Yeah.
okay. That's okay. And so that's the first thing. But how do you know you're getting a bad deal? And that's where your homework and your preparation comes in. So
Mhm.
you're going to start by analyzing your value, what you bring to the table, that's your core competencies. What are you specifically good at that has this other company interested? And the first thing to recognize is that if this company, if they're a larger company, much larger company, good opportunity for you, if they are investing the time to come and negotiate with you, you have some power there. They wouldn't waste their time otherwise. Big companies, they don't go have meetings for no reason. They have meetings to put value in their pocket. And so the first thing to recognize is that you have some level of opportunity there. And then you want to understand another concept, a bit more jargon in negotiation. There's a term called BATNA, and it's an acronym, BATNA, and it stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. And what that means, so this is from the Bill Urey at the Harvard Program of Negotiation. He and a few colleagues came up with this term 30, 40 years ago. And it's very useful. It's easy to understand it kind of as a plan B. So if I can't make this deal with you, what's my plan B? What's my next best deal? What else can I go to? And similarly, I want to understand if you can't make a deal with me, what's your alternative? What is your next best choice if you and I cannot come to agreement? And so that is a benchmark on, against which any deal should be measured. Because if I know that I can get this deal, if you and I can't come to agreement, I don't want to make an agreement with you that's worse than that opportunity. If I can get $100 per unit from my plan B, all else equal, why would I accept $95 per unit from you? And so, assuming those are mutually exclusive, right?
Sure.
And so that exercise in the preparation phase of understanding we call it power analysis. So understanding the areas from which you draw power, and that give you that ability to be at the table with this presumably more powerful counterpart. You understand why that is, and then you really do a deep analysis of what positions are important to you. These are the terms that you want. Why do you want them? What else could you get from another party? What your BATNA is, and just making sure that you have a really firm understanding of those variables, and that'll stop you from selling the store, so to speak. But if you go in unprepared and you don't know what your alternatives are, you can feel cornered, and you can feel like it's all or nothing, right? If I don't make this deal, my business is toast. And that might be true, but that doesn't mean you should still take a bad deal. A bad deal by any definition is just where you're losing more than you're getting. And so
a bad deal can mean burnt toast. So
exactly. Yeah. So it's really about, so there's certainly an element where the practice of negotiation, and this is something I encourage, and one of my peers, a guy named Phil Brown out of London, he has an excellent method for practice where he has these negotiation flashcards, where that's a big part of his instructional, is getting people used to the repetition of negotiating, because it is something that you get better at with practice, like many things. And so there's an element of that, right? You want to be able to conduct yourself well at the table. But you also cannot conduct yourself well from a behavioral perspective, or you can't at least perform as well from a behavioral perspective if you don't have the data you need, that understanding you need of what the variables are, and what you can get, what you should give, and all of that. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Now, we can't get out of here of a Titan's tale without telling a story. So tell me a story where you helped someone negotiate a deal that really worked out well, and just like a slam dunk in some ways.
Sure. So this is a story that I'm actually really proud of. I think this is a good one to go with. I have lots of negotiation tales, but this is one that's really near and dear to my heart. So I'm a big believer in being involved in your community, and so I've got my professional life that intersects a little bit with this, because there's professional considerations. But I've been serving on the board of a museum in my community for the last 8 years or so, and shortly after I joined, a year and like 9 months, 10 months after I joined, I had never served on a not-for-profit board before. I didn't know. I was still learning about museums and operations, but I cared about the mission, still care about the mission. And the president of the board came to me and he said that we'd really like for you to be the next president of the board. And so it was an incredible honor. And I tried to talk them out of it, but I was unsuccessful in that negotiation, and they wound up electing me president. That was a failure in negotiation. But what that led to, and I'm really happy that it went this way, because early into my tenure as president, I wound up serving for 2 years, which was the term limit.
Mm-hmm.
The executive director came to me, and she was expecting her first child. And so we are a small organization. We have a small budget. We have small staff. We're quite a bit bigger now, but especially at the time, we were very lean, and we didn't have a lot of excess capacity for anything. And so she came to me, and she's pregnant and wanted to talk about family leave, about maternity leave in her case. And we're in New York State, so New York State has some rules, and at the time, we were obligated to cover, I think it was 55%, or excuse me, the state would cover 55% of her compensation for 8 weeks. But I'm a father, and so we've got 3 children, and I know how important, I firmly believe that family leave is really important, and I think it's something that's very reasonable for an employee to expect. And so 8 weeks at 55%, that just frankly wasn't good enough for me, and it wasn't good enough for her. And she was right, it shouldn't have been good enough. So I wanted to offer her 100% pay for 12 weeks. And so which is what I had benefited from when I was, or rather what my wife had benefited from when we had our children. And so I went to the executive team, I went to the executive board, and there were a few of us. And I pitched this to them. I said, we don't have any family leave policy in place right now. We have to comply with the state regulation, of course. But I want to go beyond that. This is what I would like to see happen here. And I didn't need the response to be unanimous, but I wanted it to be unanimous. I wanted every single member of the executive committee to be on board with this. And I had 3 out of 4 of them out of the gate. So 3 of them immediately said absolutely, completely agree. That's what we would like to see as well. But I had my outlier, I had my holdout. And so I had individual conversations with each of them, and I went to the holdout and I said, okay, let's take a look at this. What bothers you about this? And he said, well, I'm worried about the cost, really, principally. I'm worried about what this is going to cost us, and I'm worried about coverage for the executive director's duties. So I said, okay. I said, these are reasonable problems. These are reasonable challenges to have. And I also think they're fixable. So I went back to the other folks with whom I'd already agreed, and I said, all right, these are the challenges that we need to overcome. We need to make sure we're good on cost, and we need to make sure we're good on coverage of duties. So we put our heads together and we said, okay, well, one thing, I did the analysis on it, and we were coming out ahead on this. So if we didn't need to hire any more staff, the state was subsidizing 55% of her pay. We were only covering 45% of it for 2 of those months. And then that got me awfully close on, that really gave me a great position for arguing for that 3rd month. So that was one thing. And we moved some expenses around and cut a little bit just to make sure that was compelling and that we were in the money on that. And that was particularly important to me. Not to mention, we already had this budgeted, right? We could have paid her. This was in the budget to pay as long as we didn't need to hire somebody else. And I said, okay, so then now that's our big problem. We need to cover her duties. So we were all really invested in this working. So we said, okay, I'll tell you what, I can give this many hours a week to making sure this museum continues to operate like it had an executive director full time. And my colleagues on the board, each of them on down the line, they said, absolutely, I can give this many hours a week. I can give this many hours a week. And all of a sudden, we had total coverage of her duties, and we had built a rotational plan to handle it during that period. So we just stepped up, right? The board did what we should have done as a board, and we stepped up for the good of the organization. And I brought this tidy package back to the holdout. And I said, we're in the money on this. It's already in the budget. And we will not need to hire any additional staff because the board leadership is going to take on these roles for the time being. And what could he say at that point? But yes. And it was easy.
You covered both of his objections. So yeah.
Yeah. And so that's really emblematic of my approach to negotiation. I'm a big believer in working to understand people's objections and provide solutions to it. And if I can't provide a solution to it, then I'll find another way to add value that really helps them overcome that. But that it's not exactly divide and conquer, although in this case it looks like that. But fundamentally, it's about that pursuit of understanding your counterparty, your business partner, whoever it might be, and making sure that they're comfortable and that they come out feeling good about it. And that's another part that. So when I talked about this 4 phases, I'll end with for this section. I'll end with this. But the 4 phases, preparation, dialogue, proposal, and close. I actually believe in a 5th phase this thing I'm developing, and that's really the follow-up phase. Because in B2B negotiations, you expect to have interactions again in the future, and you want to set the table for that as early as you can. And really, you want to do that when everybody's happy. So you close the deal, and then sometime later, depending on the deal, maybe it's 4 weeks, maybe it's 6 weeks, maybe it's 6 months. But you have another formal meeting with them and you check in. How did this go? How do we feel about this? Did it go the way we planned? Did it go the way we expected? What are our opportunities to work together in the future? This really worked well. I liked it. How else can we work with each other? And so that really that collaborative approach, and that it's really fundamentally team building in many ways, is a core aspect of my practice in teaching negotiation. Because I believe that if you're going to make a good deal, make a good deal and then make another good deal and then make another good deal after that. And let's keep these conversations and these relationships rolling.
You're making my head full of questions, but that's an excellent idea. Do you suggest that at the end of the initial negotiations, we agree that we're going to meet X amount of days later? Just set it up in the calendar then.
I like doing that because this dovetails nicely with what I teach about how to close a deal as well. It's important to me that when people close a deal, when you finally get that pen on that piece of paper, that you want them to feel good about it. You want them to leave that table feeling positive about it. And so there's an opportunity there to emphasize the mutual benefit and to start telling a bit of a story about what this will look like down the road for both companies. And the bigger the deal is, the more compelling this becomes. But you can really start that conversation at the closing table and you say, this is what we expect. I'm really excited about this. I'm so glad we were able to make this deal. I get this, you get this, everybody's happy. I'd love to circle back with you in 6 months and just make sure it's all going like we thought it would. And I don't know about you, but as a business owner, if I see somebody having that duty of care, if I made a deal with somebody and they already have that forethought and that duty of care with the future relationship, I feel great about that. And so I think it's a good way to show what kind of business person you are, what your motivations are, and what ultimately you're trying to get out of a relationship.
Great. Patrick, thank you for your time today. And I know you offer a service actually other than coaching, which is great. You actually, if it's a big enough negotiation, that you offer a service where you or your team will negotiate in behalf of someone or and help someone, right? Negotiate.
I do, yes. So the bulk of my business is helping entrepreneurs and executives learn how to negotiate, and that enablement, really helping them to develop that confidence and capability on their own, that's wonderful for me. I love that. But in cases where they need that extra help and they need an advocate at the table, that's another part of my business, and really helping to get those deals done. I'll be honest, I love that, and I'll always be at the table. But sometimes there can be a challenge with bringing in somebody who's a professional negotiator. So I find it works best when I'm able to help develop an entrepreneur and executive get to the point where they feel confident to get at that table, because that also, for me, helping to develop people, helping people grow and continue to to build their core business the way that they mean to, and to develop those capabilities. That's just wonderful for me. And so that's a big part of what drives me. But I'm really here to help with deal making and executives and entrepreneurs, and getting them to be able to grow the business the way that they want to.
Awesome. So how would we get hold of you if we wanted to get some coaching or some services that you provide?
So I'm very active on LinkedIn. And so I'm findable on LinkedIn as Patrick Griffin, or Patrick J. Griffin. And I have a website, morriganadvisors.com. So my company is Morrigan Strategic Advisors, and I own both the URLs. But morriganadvisors.com, there's a little panel that somebody can click on the contact page and reach out to me directly. And so those emails, Chris, they'll come directly to me. And so I do have support on my team, but I like to field those emails myself.
Sure. Again, that's Patrick J. Griffin, Griffin, and Morgan Strategic Advisors. And it's Morrigan.
That's right.
Patrick, thank
Yeah.
you
Thank
for
you,
your
Chris.
time today. Those are good Titans Tale stories we just shared. So we appreciate it. And everyone, we'll see you again next week on another episode of A Titans Tale. Y'all have a good week.